This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Go to our website at wdtatpodcast.com and click on support to learn how you can be part of this effort to learn how to have better conversations, increase compassion, and build bridges, not walls. You can make a one-time donation or become a patron for as little as $1 a month and receive patron-only benefits. Thanks to all of our patrons at any level for your support. We really couldn't do this without you. Now let's get into the interview. In this episode, I talk with Christina Dent about her journey changing her mind about drug policy and starting a nonprofit to promote alternatives to the criminal justice approach. We also talk about LSD and how changing your mind can feel like losing your faith. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Christina Dent. She's the founder and president of End It for Good, a conservative nonprofit that invites people to consider alternatives to our criminal justice approach to drugs and drug use. These alternatives range from ending criminal penalties for drug possession to legal regulation of substances, all with the goal of less societal harm. So welcome to the podcast, Christina.
Thanks so much, Lucas. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I was thankful that you reached out to me and was excited to read a little bit about your nonprofit. And I'm really excited to hear more of your story. So why don't we just jump into that? What was the journey that you went through? You talk about you have a conservative nonprofit. You consider yourself a conservative Christian. So what was the journey like for you? As you changed your mind about the problem of drugs and what the solutions might be? Yeah,
great question. My thinking 5-10 years ago was completely different on drugs than it is today. But I'll tell you, before I tell you the story of what changed my mind, that my values related to drugs and people and addiction have not changed. What's changed is my understanding of how we actually can better live out those values. So my mind didn't change on kind of the goal. My goal is still to have the fewest people possible harmed from drugs or drug use or addiction or their families harmed. I want less harm in the world from potentially harmful substances. That was my goal 10 years ago. It's still my goal today. So I grew up in Mississippi. I'm born and raised here and still live here. Have never moved away. Went to a Christian liberal arts college and got a degree in Bible. Met my husband there. Just had a very great upbringing in a wonderful Christian home. Never used drugs. Never had any interest in drug use. Didn't have friends that were using drugs. It was just really kind of foreign to me. And I grew up in a very politically conservative home and kind of broader community. Church community and just the people that we were around. And so I grew up just kind of the air I breathed wasn't people saying out loud, we have to criminalize drugs, we have to throw people in jail. It's just what I saw. And it was kind of part of the political campaigns of people that I saw being supported. And I thought that's just what you do. I didn't even think that there was another option than that. So the first time that somebody asked me, what do you think about legalizing drugs? I literally, my heart rate went through the roof. I could just feel my blood boiling. I could not believe that this person was asking me that. They were a Christian. How could you even consider something so against every value that we hold dear? And I just left the room. I couldn't even engage in that question at all. It just made me so angry. But then my husband and I became foster parents about 6 years ago. And over the course of several years of fostering, we fostered a little boy who had been removed from his mom's custody because of her prenatal drug use. So her name is Joanne. And before I met Joanne, I didn't know anything about addiction, didn't know anything about drug use. It was just not part of my life. And I could not understand how a mom who loved her child could possibly use drugs while she was pregnant. That I had no place in my mind where that could coincide. And so I met Joanne. Her son came straight to our house from the hospital. He was automatically removed for her prenatal drug use and put into foster care. He was brought to us as a little 5-pound, 9-ounce preemie, straight from getting discharged from the NICU. And I felt very protective of him and thought, Joanne must not be a good mom or she wouldn't have been using drugs. So I brought him to his first visit at the local child welfare office and pulled up into the parking lot with my other 3 little boys in the car with me. And I popped Beckham's car seat out of the car, turned around in the parking lot. And I hadn't met Joanne, but across the parking lot is running this woman with tears streaming down her face. She's sobbing and runs over to me and just starts covering this baby with kisses while I just awkwardly hold his car seat in my arms. And I felt suspicion. I thought, this can't be real. This doesn't fit with what I think about people who use drugs, doesn't fit with a mom who would use while she was pregnant. This just can't be. It doesn't fit for me. So I have to just say it's not real since it doesn't fit. And so she spent her 1 hour of visitation time with her son. And then I took him back to my house and she left for inpatient drug treatment a couple hours away. And so she would call me from treatment. I felt comfortable enough to give her my phone number so that she could check on him. So she would call me once a day. And she would say, "Can you put me on speakerphone?" And she would sing to him over the phone. She sent home with me a little lovey. We call them loveys in Mississippi. I don't know what people call them elsewhere. Just little like cozy things that kids kind of hold to go to sleep with. It was a little cloth animal. And she said, "Can you please let him sleep with this so that he can still have my smell with him?" And I'm thinking, wait, this is what moms like me do. Like, this is what me and my friends talk about bonding with babies and how important those bonds are in their first few months of life and how important it is for that mother and child connection to be there. And here is a mom who's showing more vulnerability over her love. Like, I couldn't even imagine myself singing over speakerphone to one of my own kids. Like, I'm seeing a level of openness and just raw willingness to do anything to engage and to be present with her son than I was even able to do or could picture myself doing. And so that really just started this war in my heart over something isn't right. Either this isn't real from her, and over time I realized I can't possibly believe that. Like, it's just, that's so far-fetched to believe she doesn't love him. She loves him just as much as I love my 3 boys. Like, absolutely, 100%, Joanne is a mom like me. And that left me with a problem because I knew that we were putting people like Joanne in prison every single day in Mississippi, in every state in this country, and around the world. And so that really started this war in my heart over, is there something else we could be doing? Like, is this feels wrong to me that we would be doing this. Is it wrong? Are there other options? What could we do differently so that we wouldn't be destroying this already vulnerable family? It was clear that she wanted to parent her son and that she wanted to be free from her addiction. And I could see that her addiction was not a lack of love for her son. It wasn't a lack of wanting to be free from it. It was this really complex health crisis, but just was not a criminal issue. Like, that would make everything worse. And so I just started learning. I started reading. I started talking to people, trying to understand what's really happening with drug use and addiction and what's happening with our policies around that. And so I learned a couple of things. One of the biggest thing that I learned was drug harms actually fall into 2 categories. So when we think culturally about drugs, we just think any harm that's possibly associated, we just kind of put it onto the drugs. Well, that's because of drugs. And I learned that actually there's two kinds of harm. There's one kind that comes from the drugs themselves, the harm that they can do to your body, potentially. But there's also this other category of harm, that's harm caused by our drug policies. It's the harm caused from criminalizing drugs. So I think about it like a little medicine capsule that has, one side's red and one side's white. And that's kind of how I think about this now. So we've been kind of swallowing this pill all in one swallow every day for the last 100 years in America and around the world, where we are ingesting the drug harms and the drug policy harms every day. That's what we live under. It's just normal to us now. And we've never really considered, for most of us, that those can be split apart, that we could have only the harms from the drugs themselves to deal with, and we could stop the policy harms from prohibiting those drugs. So that was one thing that I learned. The other was, well, what actually are those policy harms? I thought our policies were helping us. I thought they were decreasing harm. That's the whole reason why we're banning drugs, is because they harm people. But what I learned is that actually at every point in the economic structure of the drug trade and what it does to a substance and who's consuming it, that prohibiting drugs increases harm at every step of the way. So when you prohibit a popular substance, it doesn't go away. The underground market picks it up and begins selling it. As long as there's demand for any product, there's always going to be supply for it. That's just an economic reality, whether we want it to be or not. And so when we look at Central and South America, when we look at countries in West Africa, production countries, Afghanistan, they feel the level of violence that they do in their communities because of drug prohibition. So drug prohibition doesn't fight organized crime and gangs. It actually funds them by providing this $500 billion a year market for them to fight over. There's no law and order in an underground market. The only way that you get your piece of the pie is to be violent and to take it by force. So we have all of this crime. The majority of the crime in our world today is caused by drug prohibition, not the drugs themselves or what people do while they're high or anything like that. It's actually the underground market playing out the kind of violence that happens because of it on the streets. And then you have what happens to the substance when you prohibit it. So you have legally regulated substances. We know what's in them. It's on the bottle. We know how strong it is. It has the ingredients. We know how much we should take for our weight or our age or whatever the case may be. In a criminalized market, you don't have any idea. You don't know what's in that baggie you're getting. It could be really strong. It could be really weak. It could be cut with dishwashing detergent as an additive to it. It could be cut with brick dust. It could be cut with a more potent drug than you thought you were getting. You thought you were buying heroin, but really you're buying heroin mixed with fentanyl, which is far more potent and a lot easier to die from. So you lose kind of all control over this potency and purity. And then you have what happens to consumers when you criminalize them. So we have now 1 in 10 Americans uses illegal drugs. That's just a reality. That is a government number. It's actually from the Office of Drug Control Supply, which is the United States mechanism to fight drugs, to prohibit them, to enforce the prohibition of drugs. And that's their admission that 1 in 10 Americans has used an illegal drug recently. We have so many people using drugs, illegal drugs, and we're criminalizing them. So that's now 1 in 10 people that you see at the grocery store, 1 in 10 people that's behind you in the line at the bank, 1 in 10 people that, for a lot of us, it's going to include people that we're in church with. There's just a lot of substance use around us. And so we have labeled those people criminals, and we have been locking them up at very high rates. So we have now 1 in 5 prisoners in America and around the world, and in Mississippi. The statistic holds kind of no matter where you go. About 1 in 5 is incarcerated on a drug charge. And so we just have this enormous amount of harm from criminalizing a health issue. Substance ingestion is a health issue. It can also be other kinds of issues. It could be because of other things, the spiritual issues with trauma in the past, wanting
mental
to
health.
self-medicate, mental health, all sorts of things. But it's just not a criminal justice issue. It's not a criminal act to ingest a substance. There's other things going on there. So with the market and with the substance and with consumers, we just see this increase in harm, this explosion of harm on every side when we prohibit a substance. So I didn't want to come to the conclusion that legal regulation of drugs was the right thing to do. That was like my worst fear conclusion, that's what's going to be the end of this. So I kind of backed into it by saying, how could we reduce harm? And everywhere that I looked, I kept coming to that same conclusion that the best way to reduce harm, not to end it, there's no perfect world, but the best way to reduce it is through bringing that market back into legal control and regulation, bringing those substances back under legal regulation where we can have potency and purity guidelines, and bringing consumers back into being treated like patients instead of being treated like criminals. So that's a little overview kind of how I think about these issues now.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I really want to hear more about this sort of the process of changing your mind, because on this podcast, we focus a lot on topics that people don't like to talk about or avoid talking about, and also how to have difficult conversations. And one of the things that comes up a lot is how do we change our minds, or we're often focused on changing other people's minds, and we're often very closed, right? Because we believe what we believe, and we're going to stick to it, sort of like you're saying. Yes. So, in your story, there's a couple of points at which, you were sharing how you were really wrestling with the image of this mother, and having this kind of war within yourself where you said, I had to either believe that she was faking it, or that I had not understood things correctly. And I think a lot of people try to resolve those tensions pretty quickly to have an answer, right? So it's easy to say, oh, she's faking it, right? And stick with what I believe, and I'm not going to wrestle with it. I don't believe that she really, really loves him, right? Because that's kind of your prior belief, right? You sort of layer it on top of what you see instead of having to wrestle with it. But you chose to wrestle with it. You chose to dig in and okay, well, I'm going to learn more. And no, I don't think this is the conclusion I want to come to. And yet you were still somehow open to following where the truth led. And especially, these days, it feels like less and less we see people willing to do that, willing to change their minds, and willing to follow a path and really read and change their minds in such a big way, right? Such a 180 degree. So could you share a little bit about what do you think for you was helpful being able to do that, just being open to following the research and the things you were reading, and open to changing your mind, not like in a moment, but you were still willing somehow to be open to that possibility.
Yeah, I think that last thing that you said is really important. If we want to actually influence the way that people think and ask them to change their minds, is that it doesn't happen in a moment. It didn't happen for me in a moment. It happened over the course of probably 2 years till I felt really solidly like I am comfortable in this new place. Not that I don't still have some questions, not that there are not tensions there for me, but that this is what I think the best path forward is for us. And I feel confident about that enough to start a nonprofit. And now this is what I do full time, is inviting other people into the conversation about this. So I think that's the first thing, is that a lot of us want to change minds in one soundbite. If I just tell them one statistic, I don't understand why that doesn't just change their mind.
Right.
And that's just not how we work. So we host a lot of events prior to COVID across Mississippi. So we've hosted 20 different community discussions in 11 cities across Mississippi. We invite people from all over the community, different different spheres. We really want a good sampling of the community. We invite elected officials, we invite law enforcement, we invite people in the treatment community, people impacted by incarceration or addiction, pastors, doctors, kind of everybody. And we've gotten just a tremendous number of people who have come from all of those different places, mayors, judges. And I always start out the presentation that I give to them, which is kind of an extended version of the TEDx talk that I did last year, which is kind of what I've just told you of this kind of journey of changing my mind. I started out by saying, look, this is a really difficult issue. And sometimes just saying that is helpful for people to acknowledge that people bring a lot to this. And some of the things that we bring, not just to this issue, but I think to other issues too, are that a lot of us have an investment in the way that we think about something. It's going to cost us to change our minds. And we know that for ourselves. We can feel that. That's what makes us feel angry when the way that we think is challenged, because it's threatening. It feels threatening to something, some belief that we already hold. And so I call it investment aversion, that the more invested we are in an idea being true, the more difficult it is for us to engage with the possibility that it might not be. So I think this is probably especially true for people on this issue that either are in law enforcement themselves or that have family members in law enforcement. So I have a lot of people that say, well, if what you're saying is right, that legal regulation is the way to go, then I want to hear it from people in law enforcement. And I do too. And there are people in law enforcement talking about it and saying this is what we need to do. But I think it's also important to recognize that they have the most investment. We have been sending them out to enforce our drug policies for 50 to 100 years. That is a request to them to engage in an idea that for some of them will feel like, my career, if I've been a narcotics officer, what you're saying that hasn't helped? And that it may actually have harmed people. That's a really, really difficult thing to ask somebody to engage with. So I think we need to understand that people are invested a lot of times in the way that they think. For some people, it hits really close to home personally for them. And that is also wrapped up in a lot of issues for people. It is a personal issue to them in some way. And I think it's really hard. You said this in one of your previous podcasts. It's really hard to sit with complex problems without giving a knee-jerk response. Like it just, it is against the human nature to want to do that.
Very much so,
We want easy answers, and we want things to be simple. And we just don't want that. And what we're asking people to do when we ask them to change their mind is we're asking them to be extremely vulnerable. We're asking them to consider if they've been wrong about something. You know, for me, it's the issue of drugs. For other people, it's other different issues. And I don't think that we give that weight a lot of times to understand what we're really asking of people. And we say, we wonder why when we come at them with a sword, they don't respond with, oh, you're completely right. Well, you're asking someone to be vulnerable while you're coming at them with weapons. Like it's that is not a scenario where people want to be vulnerable. They get their shield out. They get their own weapons out. You know, they're ready to fight. And
your story, your answer to this question highlights that it didn't happen in a moment. It is a journey, but for so many of us, like when we arrive at the conclusion, we become the champions of that idea and warriors that are going to fight for this idea, which might be great, but we also forget that what it took to get us to the point that we're at. And so sometimes we think other people are going to skip over that somehow and change their mind just by me giving them the stats on what the war on drugs has cost us or something along those lines. So for you as a, you identified yourself as a conservative Christian, you're conservative nonprofit, and the conversation about legalization of drugs is, tends to be much more either libertarians or more left or liberal people. And you're in Mississippi, and you're I'm sure talking to a lot of conservative people.
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage that, and how do you talk to people about this issue, like you're saying, that is really hard for people, and you're coming at it from such a different angle, and it feels like you're in the middle, right? Because you still identify as conservative, and yet you're coming at this one issue from a very different perspective than most conservatives. How does that go? I just want to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I think that most conservative people have misunderstood what's happening. Like what I just explained, walking through how it increases harm to the market and makes us have deadlier substances and harms consumers and families. I don't think most conservative people, or really many people at all, really understand what's actually happening with drug prohibition. We just think drugs can be harmful, let's ban them. That seems like an obvious solution. So I am always trying to find opportunities like this to have a chance to kind of present that different perspective, so that we don't speak past each other to say, well, you clearly don't care about children. Well, I do. That's why I care about this, because I care about children being able to be raised by their parents in the home, that their parents aren't in jail, that if they have a drug problem, they're getting help. So I have found that by approaching it with really respectful, non-confrontational tones, all of our events are like the conversation I'm having with you, just very respectful and non-confrontational. People can give feedback during the discussion portion of them and say, I completely disagree, and I think you're totally wrong. And they can say that. I'm not going to correct them. I'm not going to say, well, let me tell you why what you just said is wrong. It's an open conversation for them. My goal there is to have dialogue. It's for them to be at the table. And if they're at the table of discussion, to me, that's a huge win. That's probably more than a lot of them were at before. And so that's kind of just saying, I can respect people's own journeys to come to the conclusion that they're going to come to. I think about my work, and I think maybe would do well for a lot of us crusaders to think about our work as bridge builders instead of soldiers.
Yeah.
And that's what I think. I think, if we want people to engage with us who are far away from where we want them to be, then it's our job to create some bridges to help them move towards us. So if there's a big chasm and they're happy where they are, they don't think they need to change their mind. I can say, well, they should. Well, but that doesn't change anything. Like that doesn't move them towards me. So I see it as my role, the helpful role that I can play in moving this conversation forward is to build as many bridges as need to be built to reach whoever is farthest away. And if I can build those bridges and they can move one step towards where I am, or even just the dialogue, that's a huge win. And then maybe they'll move 2 and 3 and 4. But they're not going to move without bridges there that allow them to safely take those steps. So if we feel like we're in a battlefield and there's just a green space between the two sides, and we're saying, come on over here, but we've got our weapons out. What that feels like is, I might even want to, but I'm not sure I'm not going to get killed on the way over. You might slay me while I ask the questions that I don't even realize are not sensitive, or, I'm using terminology and I don't realize it's really offensive to call somebody a junkie, or, those were all things I walked through, and we want safety. We want room to work those out and to be able to wrestle without being, just, decimated for our lack of making the quantum leap all at one time.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And we need to have better models for how we work on change and how we work on talking to people. And, mentoring would be a much better way of thinking about how you engage with somebody, not too condescending or paternalistic maybe, but engaging with them in a sense of like, well, I've been down this road and, I can help walk with you through some of those difficult questions and be there. And rather than adversarial is kind of the model that we have for a lot of activism over the years. And it works in some cases when we need protests or when, sit-ins during the civil rights, boycotts, things that you look back and say, well, that was effective, and what were the alternatives? Maybe there weren't other alternatives. But in so many cases, there are opportunities to engage in the way that you're talking about. Okay, I have a different question. It maybe come out of left field, literally out of more of like left field. But I've noticed, there's kind of this renewed interest in using drugs like LSD and other things as a therapeutic tool. And typically that, Michael Pollan has written a book recently about it. I haven't read it, but it's on my list to read because I find that subject very fascinating, interesting. And, you were talking about the harm that drugs do. Are there uses or areas where you see, and maybe you can kind of, I don't know if you make distinctions between drugs either in terms of, I'm not going to ask you to rank which drugs are the most harmful, your top 10 or something like that. But how do you respond to those who say there are uses for drugs that are currently illegal that could be used for benefit, right?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about this is now I would say there does appear to be medical uses for a lot of currently illegal drugs. Now, because they're illegal, we can't do testing on them and research to see kind of what that would be. But there is a lot of research coming out from other parts of the world that some of these drugs are medically helpful if they're used in a supervised environment under the care of trained professionals. And that, but honestly, I did not even think there was a medical use for marijuana until after I had changed my mind on legal regulation for most substances as just being the best way that we can handle their potential harms. So heroin is definitely potentially harmful, but it's not made less harmful by prohibiting it. It's made more harmful by prohibiting it. So I would say, whether or not substances have potential medical benefits really doesn't change to me whether or not they should be prohibited. If they're popular and people are using them, then the best way to handle them is to have some regulatory control over them so that people don't overdose from not knowing what they're getting. They're not put in jail for using them. They get treatment or, whatever help that they need. But I think that we need to be open to the fact that there may be medical uses, and we should be open to the research surrounding, seeing if there are other ways that they can be used, especially if they're naturally occurring substances, in the world. That to me is, we could say it would make sense that God would put things on the earth and create things that could be used harmfully, as so much around us in the world can be used for good or for harm. But that there are also positive uses of those. That might be, but really, I don't ever talk about that, because whether or not people think that there are medical uses doesn't change the fact that if people are using these substances, they're better regulated than unregulated, whether they're using them medically or recreationally or, whatever the case may be. Prohibition doesn't make anything safer. It makes it more dangerous and more harmful.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And bringing them under an umbrella where they can be studied and have science and medicine understanding it better and being able to speak to what the harms are and what the benefits are makes a lot of sense. So I really appreciate your answer. So I want to hear more about your responses to some of the pushback that people give you. So, one is as a Christian, I imagine you get a lot of pushback that says, how can you support that as a Christian? Or, you shared one question that you get a lot, that shouldn't we just let the leaders figure this out and do what they say? And also the idea of, well, they broke the law. And it makes me, this isn't a theological podcast, but you and I are both Christians, and it comes up a lot. And we live in, a world that has a lot of Christians in it. So, a lot of people use Romans 13. Christians use that to say we should just follow the law, right? God made the government made the laws, and now they're breaking the laws. And so how can you as a Christian say that this should be legal, that we should change that? So how do you respond when somebody kind of asks you that?
Yeah, and I appreciate where that's coming from, actually, because when I was on this journey, there was a point where I really wondered, like, is this compatible with being a Christian? Like, early on, I had this feeling of, if I change my mind on does this mean I can't be a Christian anymore? Like, is this fundamentally incompatible? And I think I just had never thought about it before. And it felt like, whoa, this is a big issue. And I don't know, maybe I definitely feel like I still believe in the Bible. I still believe all the things I did before, but can I? And so it was helpful to me to start thinking through, should we make everything that harms us illegal? Should we put people in jail for any kind of harm, things that harm us? Or should we put people in jail for things that are sinful? So started thinking through, okay, what if we just took the 10 Commandments? Should we put people in jail for all of those? Well, in America, and we have tons of laws making things criminal. We have like over 4,000 different criminal laws that people can break. Only 2 of the 10 Commandments are actually like patently laws that are criminally, illegal, murder and theft. The other 8 are either not criminal at all in our law code, or, would only be criminal in very small circumstances. So that was kind of interesting for me to think through, okay, just because something we're commanded not to do it, doesn't mean that it should be illegal. And then just looking back at America's history of the things that we've had, of the laws that we've had that were not right, and that we can look back now and say, when men make laws, we sometimes make mistakes, even if we're trying to do the best that we can. And the thing to do when we make laws that we realize later are unjust or unhelpful, is to change those laws. It's not to say, well, we just are stuck like we are. We've changed laws all throughout history, and all throughout American history, realizing things that we've done in the past that weren't right. And we've come back and said, okay, now we realize this was not helpful, or this was wrong, or this was unjust, and we need to actually change that law. So when people say, well, look, people break the law, they need to, serve their time, I would say we're not asking to just stop enforcing our laws and saying, look, whether things are legal or illegal, do whatever you want. We're saying these actually shouldn't be laws in the first place. Like, these aren't helpful laws to us. We need to change our laws to treat drugs as a complex health issue, and people who use drugs as needing help if they need help. But certainly jail is not going to help someone's substance use, particularly if they have an addiction. We know that that's actually made worse by trauma, and jail is one of the most traumatic environments that you can be in America. So we're kind of using trauma to try to address a problem that is made worse by trauma. So it's really this kind of vicious cycle that we're using. So it was helpful too to think about something like adultery that is harmful to always more than one person. It's just catastrophic in a family. And yet we're not putting people who commit adultery in prison. Like, we realize that even as harmful as that is, that prison isn't going to fix that. It's the wrong approach to that. There are other ways that we need to address those harms. So that was a freeing thing for me to be able to say, okay, even if I don't want people using drugs, or even if for people who would say it's wrong to use drugs, that still doesn't mean that making them illegal is the right thing to do. There are lots of things that we think people shouldn't do or that we think are wrong that we just don't put people in jail for. So that kind of freed me up to really look at the issue for what it is and to say, okay, I can be a Christian and I can be politically conservative. Now, there was a time too where I thought, does this mean I'm not conservative anymore? You know, and I thought, I feel like I still am. And I just began to realize, you know, this issue gets everybody on all sides more of what we really want. It gets us, if you're on the left, there's more justice, there's more equity, there's lots of good things happening there. If you're libertarian, it's, you know, personal rights and the ability for a person to have the freedom to ingest a substance if they want to. If you're conservative and you want issues that are, or responses that are allowing people to be employable instead of having a criminal record, if you want parents in the home raising their children, and certainly some of these everybody wants, no matter where you're coming from, if you want parents in the home raising their kids, if we want safe communities without as much crime in them, if we want approaches that save lives instead of destroy lives. So for me, as somebody who's pro-life, I see this as a pro-life issue of we have literally hundreds of thousands of people dying because of the forces at work in drug prohibition every year around the world. They're either killed in the violence from the underground market, or they die from preventable overdoses. They died from contaminated substances. Or we have people dying in our prisons, and we have families being really just destroyed and pulled apart by the forces of incarceration. So I see it as, it's not a one side issue. It's just good policy. No matter where you are on the political spectrum or on the faith spectrum, it gets us all a world that's closer to the world we really want for ourselves and our kids and future generations.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people, like you're saying, the process of pulling things apart a little bit and unraveling. It's very scary. And one of the things that I think for many issues, this one included, is that we lack very much imagination about what a world would look like if it were different. And so when we begin to imagine, as you're saying, like, well, what if I believe this, or what if I start to think this way, like, then I'm not going to be Christian, or and one question I know you get a lot is about what happens, right? So if we imagine a world where drugs are legal, people can take drugs if they want them, you know, aren't people going to become addicts? Aren't we going to have like a ton more addiction? Isn't it going to actually make the problem worse? And I'll let you respond to that, and then I want to talk more about imagination a little bit, because I think that's a helpful thing. But what do you say? You know, when people say, "Well, I can't imagine it," you know, if we do this, people are gonna we're gonna have so many addicts just roaming the streets.
Right. So I think one thing that's helpful to think about is that legal drugs, and that would be legally regulated. So age restrictions, maybe setting restrictions over how you can access certain substances. Certainly there's regulation around that. This is not heroin in the candy aisle at the 7-Eleven or something like that. No one is talking about that. And I don't mean to, that's a serious issue. But people really do picture that in their minds. And I that is not at all what I'm saying. I don't want anyone to think that I'm that we're just saying, oh, these aren't potentially harmful. Look, we could give them to anyone and it would just be better. No, they are potentially harmful. But I think it's really important to understand that the narrative that we have been told for decades about drugs is that when people use drugs, they become addicted to them. And one of the most revolutionary things that I learned on this journey was the role that trauma plays in the development of addiction for a lot of people who become addicted to substances. Now, that doesn't mean they have to have had some horrific childhood. It could mean that they're in a place in their life where they're isolated and lonely and have experienced kind of the trauma of loss of community from a move to a new city or something like that. And so there's Dr. Bruce Alexander is a professor in Canada, and he did these experiments back in the 1970s on rats. And he saw the previous experiments that had been done that I remember seeing on TV growing up. They were used in advertisements showing that, if you give a rat heroin-laced water and regular water and put it in a cage by itself, it will use the heroin-laced water so much that it will end up killing itself from it. And so this is what happens. This is what heroin does to you. You start taking it and you take more and more and more and you die. And he started thinking, that rat was in a cage by itself, and rats are highly social creatures. I wonder what would happen if we did the same experiment, but we put the rat in a cage with everything a rat could ever want. What if we put it in a cage with lots of other rats, with things to play with the kind of world that a rat would be most suited to thrive in? So he did that experiment and found that the rats rarely used the heroin-laced water, and they never used it compulsively, and they didn't die from it. Now there's been all of this other research that's been done into the role of social isolation and trauma in the development of problematic drug use. And so when we think about that, we think about, okay, the drugs are a solution attempt at a deeper problem. So people want to change the way they feel for a reason, because they don't like the way they feel right now. For some people, that's because the way they feel right now has a lot of emotional traumatic baggage that comes along with that. And so when we think about that drugs are a solution attempt at some other problem, they're not the problem themselves. And that's why even if somebody detoxes from the drug and it's out of their system, they're not physically addicted to it anymore. So often they return to that. It's not because the physical addiction is there. It's because that drug is doing something for them. It's filling some other need for them. So when I learned that, I just began putting that together with everything that I had learned in foster care about how do you help a child that's been through trauma thrive. And it is all about rebuilding trusted relationships, deep connections, deep family community. And when you think about that and you think, God did not make us that we as children thrive on connection and community and safety. And something switches in us when we become 17 or 18 and we thrive, we can heal from our trauma through more trauma, disconnection, isolation, unemployment, having our family torn apart. That just to me really shifted how I thought about people having access to substances. If we could create a world where far fewer people are dying of overdoses, far fewer people are experiencing the nuclear option of incarceration in their family, far fewer people are living in unsafe communities where the drug war is literally playing out on their streets and people they know are getting killed in the crossfire of that, we would be drastically reducing the amount of trauma that people experience. So we might have more people that choose to try a substance, but I think we would see our addiction rates dramatically decrease. And if they didn't decrease, I think we still have to ask the question, why are people using? Because it's not the drug that really causes the addiction nearly so much. Certainly there's some role, but a lot of people non-problematically use drugs. But for most people who have an addiction that they're struggling with, there's something else there. So Dr. Alexander, I had him on the End It for Good podcast and asked him, what would you do to help the U.S. right now? If you had a magic wand, what would be the one thing you would do to help us overcome our current addiction crisis? And he said, if you look at every superpower throughout modern history, you see high rates of addiction. There's high rates of anxiety and high rates of addiction that come with being a superpower in the world. And so as much as, we might not want to lose our superpower status, but there's a cost of anxiety and stress that comes with that. So I think we have to keep asking ourselves why. If we have high addiction rates, why? Why are people using the substances? The substances are just the coping mechanism for the thing that's really going on. And we have to start asking ourselves, why is that? When mental health gets worse, when suicide rates increase, we need to ask that one step further question of why is that? What's the deeper thing that's going on? And I think the same thing is true here with drugs.
Well, and you really, brought it full circle back to that mother and that encounter with her, and being able to see this other side of the drug problem, and really being forced to wrestle with the human part of it. And that's what I hear you saying. I did an episode with my friend Christina Gibson on addiction and recovery. And I'll recommend that to folks to listen a little more, in depth and more conversation about, what is it that drives people in addiction processes? I think that's really, really important. And I do want to cover trauma. I've said this in other episodes, and I have a guest that I need to line up for doing a whole episode on trauma, but it's so not very well understood, by most people, and yet it's really a part of all of our lives, and is driving us in so many ways that we're just not even aware of. And so the journey with addiction and the drug problem is also still that journey, that inner journey that we all have to try and be healthy, and then try and help other people be healthy. And I really appreciate that seems to be kind of what's at the core and the focus of your message and what you're sharing. And I just really appreciate that a lot. So we're about out of time. And I like to end the podcast with two things: going out and going deeper. A recommendation for something people can do, an action step, and something they could read, or a movie, or some kind of resource maybe that they can, for them to go deeper. Yeah. So I'll go first. Yeah. And you may have yours ready, but, do you have yours ready?
I do, but go ahead. Okay.
No, I'll let you go first. I have my going deeper. I need to think about my going out. So you go ahead.
So I would say the thing that people can do is to talk about this in public ways. So if you're on social media, now when I say that, I don't mean you have to go and say, we need to legalize all drugs tomorrow. I think that's actually the way that you can shut down the conversation the best. So that question that person asked me way back in the beginning of, do you think we should legalize drugs? That's actually the worst way that you can enter this conversation. Really what we want to do is just invite people to have some kind of thought about it, posting an article and saying, I've never really thought about it this way before, but this is interesting. Kind of invites people to the conversation. One thing that I've learned as I have been talking about this publicly, and it's hard to do if you haven't done it before. I was literally shaking. My hands were shaking as I typed in my first Facebook post a couple of years ago that was anything to do with drugs at all, saying, that I had been rethinking this issue. And what I found over time is that more and more people, as they see me as a safe place, they're seeing that I'm coming from this as a place of, even though I'm not using drugs, I don't want people to use drugs, I'm coming at it with a heart of compassion and listening, and I'm not going to shame you or blame you if you disagree with me, but for two, if you have a family member struggling. And I have realized just how many families are silently struggling, and they don't know unless you tell them that you are a safe place for them to share that with. The assumption is that if I share, I will be met with judgment, and these people will pull away. And that's the truth for a lot of people. That is what they experience. So we can't say, well, if someone ever shared with me, I would treat them kindly. They don't know that. So if we want to give them places to connect, we really need to be the ones to offer that. If we want to invite people to change their minds on this issue, we need to be inviting them to do that. And that's how I always talk about it, as I'm inviting people to this conversation. My grandfather used to say, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So you just can't force anyone to change their mind, but you can invite them into a conversation about it. You can invite them to learn about it. So the number one thing that people can do is just begin a dialogue. Even if nobody's commenting on anything you say, that was my experience in the beginning, you know, like I'm sending this out into like radio silence.
They were avoiding you.
Yeah, but the thing is they're listening, and people would come up to me in person and say, I've been watching what you've been posting and I really appreciate it. I've never thought about it like that before. Or I've been seeing what you've been posting. My son is struggling with addiction and we've done everything and we just feel so alone. It's a gift to people to be able to show them that they have a safe place to just somebody to talk to if they don't already. So that would be the thing I would say people can do. A resource for going deeper. And actually, is it Christina Gibson? Is that who I'm thinking of who did the episode? Okay. So she mentioned Johann Hari's TED Talk, I think, in her episode, Everything You Think You Know About Addiction is Wrong. So he has a book called Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. That book is the single best resource, I'm convinced, that's in the world today to help people build the imagination that you're talking about what's happening today and what could the world look like if we changed it. It's incredibly well researched, but it's all told through stories of real people. So it's really grippingly written, and it's a narrative. So it's easy to read. It's meant for, you know, people like you and me, not for drug policy experts or, you know, academic people. And I would really highly recommend that. It gives you the space to kind of wrestle with this really complex issue that we've only been talking about for 50 minutes, but we could talk about for, 2 weeks and not cover the same ground twice. Would really, really highly recommend that book. We have done book discussions on it here in Mississippi. That's what our community discussions grew out of. And we actually have sponsored now, we sponsor it for Mississippi readers. We have sent out 2,000 copies to people in Mississippi who want to learn more. So going back to your question about what do conservative people think, people want better answers than what we have had before. They are hungry for a different solution. Everybody knows what we're doing isn't working. And people aren't sure what we could do differently. And so we have found unbelievable interest. I thought we were going to be plowing in concrete. And what I found is fertile soil to have this conversation across political spectrum, across faith divides, all of that. People want to know, how can we better address drugs in a way that doesn't harm so many people and end up with so many funerals that people are attending. Yeah.
It's so encouraging to hear that too, that you think sometimes those topics are going to be just a wall and no movement and no discussion, and then you are surprised so many times. I'm going to piggyback on your going out, your action step, and because it's in line with what you're saying, but I just want to emphasize that it's taking a risk, and a lot of times we're nervous. You were posting on Facebook about this thing, and it was a risk, right? And you might be, starting, like you said, starting a conversation with somebody about something. We avoid, that human beings are risk averse. We don't like to put ourselves out there. We don't like to be vulnerable. It's a scary feeling. But I think as we practice taking risks, small risks, a little risk at a time, at your workplace or your church or with, different people, you begin to find, I think as you're saying, that there is more fertile soil out there and less concrete, and you do get to have really good and interesting conversations, and people surprise you. So I want to encourage us all to be willing to take risks. Obviously, let's all be safe, but take a risk in your conversations and being vulnerable with people, because it does open so many doors, like you're saying, and really people do feel alone and isolated. So I think that's a great one. For my going deeper, I will, of course, recommend End It for Good podcast. I think people need to check that out for more information. I'm going to check out this conversation with Bruce Alexander because I'm very, very curious to hear more from him. I'd heard of that study, but it reminded me how interesting it was to think about that study. And then now I'm really like hungry for more. I'll put the episode with Christina Gibson in the show notes for this episode. And then I'll recommend again, I think I recommended it in her episode, the book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. I think I gave it the wrong name in that episode. I think I got it right this time, hopefully. Yeah. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Gabor Mate, also another Canadian. I don't know. The Canadians, maybe they're onto something, and we need to we need to listen to more Canadians on this.
Columbia is the most forward-thinking on drug policy of anywhere in North America and really in our hemisphere. They've been doing the most innovative and helpful health-based approaches to drugs for a number of years. Yeah. And I want to tell you before we close, I want to give an update on Joanne, not to leave people hanging with whatever happened in that story.
Yeah.
So she has been sober for 4 years now, pretty much since her son was born. And we went to his first birthday party. We went, she has come and visited me when she's back in town. And she is celebrating, she'll celebrate 5 years of sobriety this December. So it's really amazing to see her raising her son. He went back with her just a little while after he came to us. And so she's just doing great. And it's really amazing to see what can happen. Doesn't always happen, but what can happen if we allow people to get the help that they need and meet them with, compassionate care and the kinds of things that will give them the best chance at having this kind of future. So it's really amazing to see that happen. That doesn't always happen. There's lots of people. Nikki is one of them. She had a baby about the same time as Joanne, was fostered by a family that we knew. And instead of being offered help, she got prison. So she's in prison today, in Mississippi. She's got a 15-year sentence. And it just doesn't have to be that way. It can be more like Joanne. Not always that way, but we have the best opportunity if we do things differently.
Yeah. Christina, thanks so much for giving your time and talking to us about this topic. And I hope it really encourages people to explore more and to understand better this, as you said, a really complex topic. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. If people want to get in touch, you can email me at Christina@enditforgood.com. I love hearing from people. I love the dialogue. I love talking about questions. And that's just what we do at End It for Good. We do questions and dialogue and journeying with people. So come journey with us.
Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Hope Fellowship Mennonite Church for their generous support of the podcast. Also, many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?
Que le vaya bien.